Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. Hello and welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast. Since the beginning of law enforcement and corrections, officers have had to verbally try and change the actions of others to prevent force from being used to control that incident or that situation. There have always been those who could communicate very well in this manner. Those officers were able to get their point across without resorting to force. Some were able to do it by helping the person work through the, logical reasons why they should or shouldn't continue their actions or behavior. And then there's always, there's been those officers that had that Clint Eastwood glint in their eye, that kind of struck fear in the minds of others and alluded to the unpleasant possibilities of what could happen, if they stayed their course. And I think I had a little bit of both. I think I was able to generate that little bit of fear of the unknown, as well as I think I was a pretty good communicator with the inmates. But I didn't start off that way. I absolutely didn't. I went through a lot of training. I tried to change how I did things a lot, which a lot of change, of course, happens when you realize and when you decide to make those changes. When the outcome is force of any kind, there's always been a side that believes, a side of the public that believes the fault lies with the officer for not giving the person a chance, for not talking them out of it, for, I even heard hadn't been that many years ago, for not shooting them in the foot instead of the chest, when they attacked you. There's always going to be those people that believe, force for any reason is wrong, that we can always avoid force. Now, anybody listening to this podcast that's been a prison officer, a correction officer, detention officer knows that that's not true. There are people who are intent on hurting you or hurting other people. There are truly evil people that live in our jails and prisons. And that's part of our job is, keeping those people from the public. But with us doing that, it also gives the public this false perception, since they don't get to look those evil people in the eye, those dangerous people, that I think the public they start thinking that they don't exist and that, we're the problem when force happens. It's not that loving person who's asking them for another $10 in their commissary books when they call them at home. So, like everything else in life, the truth, lies somewhere in the middle of that. Not every incident needs to be met with force, nor can every incident be solved through verbal communication alone. And that's the path we have to walk on, or the tightrope that we walk in corrections and law enforcement. But with that, I do believe that every incident can be improved with de-escalation. And that's what we're going to talk about today, mainly is de-escalation. I've been around for a while, so I've seen where a lot of staff that I worked with over the years believed that de-escalation was a form of, it was giving in. And I admit early in my career, I had some of the same thoughts. But the longer I worked in corrections, the more I saw it as the tool that it is, the more I wanted to improve on that. And the more I wanted to, bring that into my toolbox. So let's talk about what's some of the advantages of de-escalation? Why is it good for us? Not only why is it good for the inmate or the suspect, but why is it good for us? And one of them is that, proper de-escalation will always cause an incident to become less dangerous or difficult. And let me explain what I mean. If we have the time and if we can take the time to talk to the inmate, and we're talking professionally, I mean, you can go blow somebody up, but if we're legitimately taking the time to try to talk to that inmate, to give them a moment to think, to give them a moment to express what they're feeling, that's always going to make it less dangerous and less difficult. De-escalation provides you've all heard this, a tactical pause. And if we have that moment, if we have that tactical pause, it slows things down. It gives everyone involved a brief moment to think. And it also slows down a person's fight or flight response. You're less likely to fight somebody who's had a few moments to think, who's had a few moments to reflect on consequences or, and I don't want to turn that into threats, but the consequences of what could happen if they continue, with these actions. And that's all of us. It's not just inmates or suspects. We're all that way. How many times have you, been working with somebody else and a limb come up and slap you in the side of the head? At that first instant, you're mad. You're mad enough to fight that, that hurt. Once you step back from that and you take a minute and your immediate fight or flight drops down, and that's just a natural instinct within us. So we have to understand that we're dealing with that in inmates, in suspects. Another thing that I believe de-escalation does, and I probably didn't realize this as much until I became a supervisor, but de-escalation is a tool that can buy us time for planning, okay? And any situation that we can have time to plan and prepare for is one that's going to have a better outcome for all sides. The way we used to do it isn't necessarily the best way. When something had happened, the door would pop, we'd run in unprepared. We didn't have anything to put on, protective clothing. The inmate was still as mad as he could possibly be when we went through the door, and we went in there and basically slugged it out. And that was how it started when I began. And that's not necessarily the best way. It is a tool that allows us to plan and prepare, maybe to get less lethal up there. And I'm going to talk more about, towards the end of this podcast, a little bit more about less lethal de-escalation, my thoughts on it. But allows us to get less lethal in there or non-lethal systems, which gives us more tools and more options. And, if successful, de-escalation may stop the need for a use of force altogether, which I know how that feels sometimes. I've been dressed out and stood at that door and pumped up and ready for them to throw the door open and go in there and get to fight on. But the older I got, the smarter I believe I got, or the more educated I got, I understood that, if we can not do a use of force, that's a win for staff safety every time. I saw a lot of people, including myself, who got hurt doing use of forces. And then when I became a supervisor, I had to start thinking, was that use of force necessary? And yes, I thought, is that use of force necessary on the inmate's behalf? But mostly, I'm going to tell you the truth, I thought, was that use of force necessary for my staff and staff safety? Is there something else I could have done to avoid putting them in the position to get hurt? Because when a staff member gets hurt, it's not just them. That can affect the agency. It can affect their family. It can affect their life. I've spent, last month I spent 4 times in physical therapy, working on a shoulder from an injury from a use of force at least 14, 15 years ago. That injury still hangs with me and I still have to deal with it from something that probably, and I know the specifics of that one and I'm not going to go into it, but probably we didn't need to do that use of force that day. That was one that was brought on by people's emotions. And, here I am still living with an injury, although it doesn't bother me horribly. It does prevent me from doing some things. So I've always thought since then, is it a win for staff safety? Can I get that inmate to submit to hand restraints and, come out of that cell without having to send staff in there and get them hurt? De-escalation is it's the newest interpretation of what we do with communication. But, 30 years of training law enforcement staff, that gives me a broader perspective. I'm not just looking at a few years. I can look across 3 decades there and see how we've led up to this. And de-escalation is something that's needed. Didn't necessarily start out that way. This isn't law enforcement corrections' first foray into communication. They've been trying to improve that forever. Probably since the time, of Andy and Barney, who are two examples. Andy was very good on Mayberry about de-escalating situations, and Barney was usually just the opposite. He was very good about, souping people up and making situations larger than what they needed to be. Law enforcement communications known this for a long time. But when I first started as a correctional officer, if there was an incident that required a cell extraction or a use of force team, the officer on the floor usually told the inmate to stop. Stop doing that. Stop, whatever you're flooding, breaking the window, whatever they're doing. Or a use of force team is going to come in there and take you out of that cell. And it was basically just a threat. Sometimes that threat worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes there were inmates that just took those threats as a challenge. Well, bring them on. And we had several inmates that, about the time they'd get healed up from the last one, they'd do something to get the team to come in on them again. I knew one inmate who, his whole goal was to touch the hallway, outside of the cell. If he could get past us and put a hand in the hallway, he thought that he'd won, and he quit fighting at that point. He fought like a bear unless he can get that arm past us and smack that hallway with his hand, and then he thought that he won, and he would quit fighting. So I've seen, a lot of different interpretations of that, but some of those inmates did take it as a challenge. But when I first started, basically all we were doing was just issuing a threat. There wasn't much communication to it, and there certainly wasn't any two-way communication. But within a few years, I guess the next evolution was to bring cameras into cell extractions. Because when I first started, there weren't cameras there. That was a big thing the first time that they brought cameras in to film a use of force. And that was done because use of forces before that time, there were use of forces where staff were not doing what they were supposed to, and basically inmates sometimes were getting their ass beat. Now, granted, there's just like there is today, there's times when inmates precipitated the whole problem and ended up taking consequences of what they started. But from an administrative point of view, the liability that was taken on with that, they needed to understand that use of forces were being done correctly every time, and they weren't. I was there and watched that. So the next evolution was to bring in, cameras. So all of our cell extractions, they started having the camera. And most of these use of forces, cell extractions started with, whatever the ranking lieutenant or sergeant was, and they'd be telling an inmate, will you submit to hand restraints? And this was usually followed by a loud F you, no. So the inmate would yell out something like that. And that was the entire form of communication. Now, they did take time to give the inmate that one last chance to submit to hand restraints. But we still didn't have a whole lot of communication going on here. And this is mainly what I called, it's just documented refusal. It wasn't really de-escalation or communication. It was just documenting refusal. So, if anything happened later on, here the agency had a recording of the inmate refusing to stop this incident and submit to hand restraints. So that placed the blame there squarely on the inmate. And that was kind of the way the agency looked at it. The officers couldn't be held to fault because they'd given that inmate the chance to submit. So that was the next, thing I remember. And several years we went along doing that. But the first formal communication class that I received was what they used to call verbal judo. And I don't know if verbal judo still exists as much these days, but it was a next step in our evolution, in learning to communicate, or at least mine. And I learned quite a few things from it. I won't say it changed my life dramatically, but I did learn some stuff. The class focused, in my memory, The class focused mainly on paraphrasing, which simply means restating in your own words, what the other person has said. And we would practice that in class. And, that's a skill that you have to be careful with. The inmate might say something like, hey, I was supposed to get a hamburger on my tray and I didn't get a hamburger on my tray. And then you would come back and you would paraphrase that to him to show him that you were listening. And you can do that a good way or a bad way. You can go, oh, so you're saying you didn't get a hamburger on your tray. Is that what you're trying to tell me? That's not really paraphrasing, and that's antagonistic. What you'd say is something along the lines of, so just so that I understand what you're saying, you didn't get a hamburger on your tray. And that would give that inmate a sense of that he was being listened to. And it did improve our communication on cell extractions and use of forces. A lot of times I've found over the years, the inmates just want to feel like they've been heard. And I've never been on the other side of the bars, but I have worked in these areas for a long time, and I think I see inmates, and you've got all the, the drone of just male voices all making noise all day long. Everybody wants something. And I think there are inmates who feel like they didn't get heard. Everybody else got heard, but they didn't get heard. Nobody took time for them. I do think that you will see those inmates let that build up until they do something to make sure that they do get heard, And once somebody's paying attention to them, you guys have dealt with the same inmates I have, and once somebody pays attention to them and they get to, show their ass for a little bit, well, okay, I'll cuff up, and then they cuff up and you're done with it for another couple of weeks. I think verbal judo did have, some effect on especially my communication skills. I did try to learn how to use that. You can use that anywhere in life, not just prison, but if you want somebody to know that you heard what they said, paraphrasing is a good skill. After verbal judo, we went through a time that I remember as confrontational avoidance. And so we would have a person who was not associated, with the team, and this person was going to be the confrontation avoidance person. This person was going to go to the cell, try to initiate dialogue with the inmate. And actually, this was the first time I remember us trying to really communicate with the inmate, maybe try to find out how this incident started or progressed, how the inmate's, feeling about this, what's got him blowed up to this point. Was it something that happened there, or is there more going on? Did he get a letter from home? So this was the next stage of communication that I remember in corrections, was confrontation avoidance. And I remember, including myself, I've been resistive to some of this too, but I remember a lot of staff really didn't like that. The term empathy kept showing up, and people were like, I'm not showing an inmate empathy. I'm not empathizing with an inmate, and I think, and I feel this way too, you have to be really careful. Empathize, to a lot of us, feels like we're sharing feelings with someone. And that's not what empathizing is. Empathizing with someone is understanding what their feelings are. Now, I don't want you sharing feelings with an inmate. That's the first step in manipulation. Empathizing with the inmate should have nothing to do with how you feel, okay? The inmate shouldn't be discussing, well, what do you think about this? This is simply about them. And it kind of goes back to the paraphrasing. Empathizing would be something along the lines of, well, if I get this right, I think you feel like you're not being listened to. And that is how I would empathize with an inmate, is to talk to them about how I'm understanding how they're feeling, not how I feel about this. So don't confuse empathy with sympathy, okay? You don't have to sympathize with the inmate either. I don't feel sorry for the inmate, but I can go to the inmate and say, I understand that you're upset and that you got a letter from home last week that your mom had passed away. Is that what's, got you feeling bad? I can empathize that way. I can show him that I understand, what's causing some of this. But I'm not going to sympathize. I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the people that have gotten themselves in these situations. And I'm not going to share my feelings with them. That's not what empathy is. Sharing feelings with an inmate is the first step to manipulation, always. So we never want to do that. But I can empathize with them. And so that was the first time that I took a step down that road, was when we started talking about confrontation avoidance, when we started training for confrontation avoidance. And there were a lot of skills, and I know a lot of people that had success. Some people were more successful than others. Some people are better at that than others. So it was our real first step into getting that, two-way communication and trying to get to the root of the problem. And then, in the last few years, I don't know exactly when, I've been hearing, de-escalation used as a form of communication for the last few years. Now, we'd talked about de-escalation. There's been military de-escalation for years. We talked about de-escalation in the teams for a long time. With negotiations also, they spoke about de-escalation. But the training for every officer, and this isn't just corrections, this is law enforcement on the street. There are a ton of de-escalation classes. Pull it up on the internet and you can find any number of classes that you could go to and learn about these de-escalation skills. So this is the newest generation, I guess. That's what I'm going to talk about today, is what is de-escalation? How do we do it? Some of my thoughts on it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is establishing rapport. And that's one of the main parts of communication of any kind, is establishing rapport. And I will tell you, and I've told younger staff this before, establishing rapport shouldn't happen at the door. Unless you're just pulled off another shift and they say, hey, come here, we need you to, stand at the door and de-escalate this while the use of force team's getting ready. I understand that. But building rapport with your inmates should happen every day. You should be the most knowledgeable person in that housing unit. You should know enough about what's going on in that housing unit that the inmates approach you. Okay? Inmates should come to you for answers. And that's how you're going to build rapport. Now, when I talk about building rapport, I'm not talking about the way you would build rapport with another officer or person on the street. We're not going to sit around and, talk about cars and women. We're going to talk about things that have to do with work. We're going to talk about subjects that are open for discussion within our prison environment. And those can be housing unit chores. They can be how this inmate can be working to better himself. Rules within the housing unit. Like I said, you should be the most knowledgeable person in that. They should come to you for those answers when they need to know something. So that rapport should be established early. But if you are that person who's called up and you don't have time to establish that rapport with your inmates, if you haven't, had them on a work crew, or if you haven't been able to interact with them in the housing unit appropriately. And so when we start this conversation, when we start this communication, I know you guys have seen this before, but the words that we say are only 7% of the communication that goes back and forth between two individuals, okay? Body language of how we speak is 55%. And then our voice and our tone of voice is 38%. So when we start this, if you walk up to the door and you've got this look like you're mad on your face and you say, this is Lieutenant Cantrell, come here to the door. You're not going to get very far with building rapport. Your tone, your posture, which my wife used to make fun of me, and it's absolutely true. Since inmates so often try to and attempt to manipulate us, most correctional officers are very closed off. And how you can see this is to look at them in public. Okay? They usually have their arms crossed in front of them. And what that does is put a distance between them and other people, and it makes them appear a little bit bigger. And people don't tend to want to approach people that have their arms crossed like that, even if they're smiling, because the body language says, I don't want to be bothered. And my wife would always get on to me because we'd be at, like, I don't know, a Boy Scout meeting, and she'd say, quit your correctional officer pose. And because I would, I'd be standing up against the wall with my arms folded, and nobody felt like they could come talk to me because I was giving off this vibe of I don't want to be messed with. We have to be careful of that because as correctional staff, we carry that with us a lot. But so go to the door, identify yourself. Hey, this is Lieutenant Cantrell. Can you step over to the door for a minute? Yeah, I just want to talk to you for a minute. Identify your purpose. What's your purpose for being there? And what is it genuinely? Hey, I'd like you to come here and talk to me for a minute. Can you tell me what's going on? I'd like to resolve this. Isn't that your purpose? To get this resolved? Be respectful. These are all things that you can do to build rapport with that inmate. And this isn't the time to try to be intimidating or to use threats. Hey, come here. Yeah, if you don't stop this, you'd almost send the use of force team in there. I know that's what may be going to happen, but that comes across to that inmate as a threat. So that's what we want to avoid is threats. We want to avoid sounding robotic. Don't sound like you've talked to every other inmate like this 12 times before you get to this one. Try to build that rapport. Try to understand what's got them started today. Is it a bad mood? Is it a bad letter? Was something genuinely happened? Are they crazy? All of these could be answers to that question. The next thing I want to talk about is engaging the inmate. And what does engaging do? Well, it does a couple of things. It occupies the attention of the inmate. Why is that important? Well, you're doing two things. One, you're communicating with that inmate, and when he's communicating with you at that level, when you're engaged with them, there's real communication happening, okay? But the other thing that's going on in the background is planning and preparation. If staff do have to go through that door, and we do have to have a use of force, and we can't end this through de-escalation, the staff are going to be better equipped, better prepared, have a better plan, have other tools in place so that they're safer when they go through that door. So it's kind of a twofold thing on what you're doing here. Well, and while you're engaged with that inmate, try to establish what the issues are and why they're important to the inmate. Now remember, things that are important to an inmate may not be important to you or may not seem important. Example of that, I knew an inmate that had a plastic cup, an issued cup in segregation that was a different color than everybody else's, and that had been taken. And he had a certain amount of identity attached to that cup. Now, this isn't going to make a lick of sense to you, and it doesn't matter to you. It's a plastic cup, and all plastic cups are interchangeable. But to that inmate, that was a part of his identity. He'd had that one cup for years, and now it was gone. And he wasn't, in his mind, special from the other inmate. And like I said, it doesn't have to make sense, but that's what that inmate was feeling. The other thing you're doing while you're engaging this inmate and while you're building that rapport is gaining intelligence. Now, you don't want the inmate really catching on to that because that's going to take away from your ability to build that rapport and to engage with him. If you're, looking around the cell and trying to see whether he's put, soapy suds in something to throw on the floor, or if he's tied strips of bed sheets across the floor to try to trip up the team when they come in, if he's built weapons, if the mattress is off his bed, it's going to be used as a barricade. Look at that stuff, but don't make it too obvious, because that is all good intelligence that you can go back and give that team leader when it comes time. This is the time when we talk to the inmate about issues. What's the issue? Explain to me what the issue, your side of it. Explain the importance of communication and how it benefits the inmate. But transition to issues. Talk about what's the issue for the inmate. What's he see as the issue? Talk to him how important it is that we continue this communication. Because the longer you communicate, The longer you engage with this inmate, the more rapport you build, the less likely this is going to go to a use of force. That's your job at this point if you're de-escalating this. That fight and flight is disappearing off his radar. He's not as wound up. He's not as anxious right now. There's not as much fear. And fear and anxiety is what causes that fight and flight. Check for understanding. Make sure that the inmate understands that you're trying to understand. And this is a good chance for you to use the paraphrasing skills or the empathy skills. Hey, let me check. I just want to understand. So you feel like blah, blah, blah. And that's a good time to do this, is when you're engaging with them, letting them know that you understand what they're talking about. Now, the next part is probably the most difficult part, in my opinion, and it's when you start exploring. Inmates, a lot of times, like children, they don't explain themselves. A lot of them weren't born with good communication skills, so they don't know how to communicate things very well. So you may have to explore a little bit and ask questions to find out what are these needs and what are his motivators? What's causing him to think this way? Well, they took my plastic cup. I didn't get to go to church service this week. I really feel like I needed to talk to religious services because my mother's sick in the hospital. I just got a letter. That may have been where this all stemmed from. And by the time it gets done and works back around, we're talking about whether or not the hamburger on his tray was as big as the hamburger on the inmate next to him's tray. But in his mind, he just had this fear and anxiety building up. He was worried about his mother. He wanted to talk to religious services. They didn't take time to stop to him today. Nobody cares about him. He's going to fight somebody. And that's the way this works a lot of times. It doesn't have to make sense. But if we can get them to stop and understand what the root causes of this sometimes are, or what it is that's motivating this, a lot of times they can even see, well, that didn't make sense. And it doesn't. We'll give them the opportunity to not go forward with just this fight or flight. They just want to fight because they're mad, because they're scared. We want to explore what's going on with them. And it may seem, you guys have seen this one before. You've got an inmate that just in the dining room reaches over and throws a punch at somebody, and nobody knows why he hit him. And then investigations will find out, another week or so that he wanted to get locked up because he had debts or, to somebody, and they were fixing to collect on that debt. So it had nothing to do with the guy sitting next to him. That's his motivator had nothing to do with dislike or hate for that inmate. It was simply debt that he was trying to get away from. A lot of times we don't know those motivators. We need to reach for them and try to understand what the root cause of what's going on is. During this time, this is one of the things I want to say is avoid speaking more than listening. It's one of the best things you can do when you're doing de-escalation. If you can get them to talk, let them talk. And don't get to where you're watching the clock. Well, I've got 5 minutes before the lieutenant wants to go through the door. That's irrelevant when we're talking about de-escalation, okay? If you can get them to talk, let them talk as long as they're staying on subject. If they're talking, you're building rapport. They wouldn't be talking if they didn't think that you weren't engaging with them and that there wasn't some level of understanding. They would stop talking if that wasn't occurring from their view. Don't get in a hurry to always be the one speaking. And I know a lot of times we try to, you could be doing this, or you should be doing this, or maybe this is what got you. We don't need all that right now. That's not what we're working towards. We're de-escalating this. And a lot of those are statements that will escalate, that will remind them of problems that they can't fix. Speak less, listen more. Next, we're going to enable the inmate. We're going to enable him to make a different choice here, okay, to kind of back up and go down a different path. This is a time when we want to explain to him how compliance and consequences will affect the outcome. Consequences shouldn't be threats. When we talk to them about consequences, take the inmate who didn't get to see religious services. Well, this might be a time to talk to them about, if we can go ahead and resolve this, you're going to get out of here quicker, and you're going to be able to go to church service more often when you want to. That's a positive consequence of not going forward with this, not getting those extra reports or incident reports, violations, whatever you call them at your agency, and gives them something to think about, gives them something long-term to think about, something outside of that moment. Give the inmate a way to get out of the situation. Now, don't take me wrong with this. I'm not talking about getting rid of the consequences, but you can help him make decisions through communication that help him understand that these consequences are better than these consequences. Sometimes a way out might be something that we can't afford to do, like maybe a cell move. Well, we're going to move you, we're going to pack your property, and you'll get that property back here in a week. So that he understands that there were consequences, but the consequences weren't so dire that he can never recover from them. One of the early things I learned from one of the older officers, and he told me, don't ever take everything from an inmate. And in segregation, I've seen that happen quite a bit. The inmate continues to get in trouble. He does more stuff. The staff goes in there. We take more and more stuff till he's left with nothing. Once you take everything from an inmate, he has nothing to lose. He has nothing to look forward to. So we don't ever want to get to that situation unless it's a self-harm situation. But with regular inmates, we don't want to get in that situation where we have taken everything from them so that they no longer have anything to lose. Because an inmate without anything to lose is hard to handle. A person on the street without anything left to lose is hard to handle. And finally, we're going to talk about compliance. We're going to try to gain compliance from them. We've talked to them. We've communicated with them. We've engaged with them. They now feel like we're having communication. They may feel like we understand or empathize a little bit with what they're going through. And now it's time for us to try to gain that compliance, to obtain a willingness to submit. I'm going to ask for compliance. I'm going to help them understand what I will and what I will not do. Yes, if you submit to hand restraints, we're going to get you out of there. We're going to get you cleaned up. We'll get you a shower, and we'll put you back in a clean cell. But I'm not going to make deals like, well, you're going to get all your property back, or you get to keep this. We're not making deals here. This isn't Price is Right. But it doesn't hurt for you to tell them what you will and what you will not do. Some of them will try to say, hey, well, since we're not going through with the use of force, I don't want the violation for this. Well, if they've already earned that violation, if they're already going to get that violation, we shouldn't be in too quick a hurry to take that away. If they have earned a disciplinary action, they should get that disciplinary action. I try not to use that as a bartering chip. Only in extreme cases would I even consider that. But what I will consider as bartering chips is anything that they have got coming. If they've gotten all messed up and covered in stuff, then, I can get you a shower. That's something we can do. That doesn't take away from anything that inmate's got coming. It's clean and sanitary, and for the orderly running of the institution. We could change cells possibly, and sometimes a new view, even though it is down the walk, can change an inmate's attitude. I've also found out over the years that many times the inmate that's causing you problems, you may find out that the inmates on the left or right of him is the one that's souping him up. And sometimes that change of cell could make a difference. Change of cellie. But don't ever do a change of cellie because it's their idea. We won't do that. Because once again, if you start doing that, you're going to start getting manipulated. We're going to ask for compliance. I need you to come here and cuff up. I'm going to make sure that you get a shower. We're going to get you in a new cell, and we're going to put an end to this. That's how I would phrase it. And hopefully if we've had some communication, if we've had some understanding between us, that's going to help de-escalate that. So that is what I look at as the needs for de-escalation. Of course, establishing rapport, engaging, explore, enable, and then gain compliance. And if we can do that, a lot of times we can communicate at a level that will end these things and keep us from having to send staff through that door. Now, another thing I told you I was going to speak on is less lethal or non-lethal de-escalation. So a lot of people don't understand less lethal or non-lethal de-escalation. How can you use less lethal or non-lethal yet still call it de-escalation? Well, the reason we talk about de-escalation with non-lethal or less lethal is because of where that use of force is generally headed. We may have use of forces where an inmate has made a weapon inside that cell. Okay? On the outside, if we're taking a look at this, what level of force could we possibly be forced to use against an inmate who was well armed and wouldn't give up? What level of force would we have to use there? Well, of course, that could be lethal force, right? We could be causing that inmate serious or deadly injury. And the same thing could happen even with a use of force team. Now, it's not designed to do that, but there are inmates who have gotten serious injuries from a use of force team. So can we do something above verbal, yet below, lethal force that's going to help us with that? And the answer is yes, we can. The lower end of the less lethal or non-lethal scale, of course, is going to be systems like just regular OC spray, like pepper ball. Pepper ball is a non-lethal system with impact and chemical there. Those are types of systems that we can jump in there. Non-lethal allows us to step in earlier in a situation. It allows a commander to exert more control over a situation because non-lethal options, of course, these require less provocation before you deploy them. A team leader, you can provide a quicker response and you can intervene at earlier and less dangerous stages of an escalating situation. If this thing's escalating and he has went from, just threats and now we're flooding and now he's putting soap on the floor, he's fashioning weapons in there, maybe he's come up with some type of deadfall for the officers as they come through the door with a piece of concrete he's taken off the wall. I've seen all kinds of stuff over the years. Less lethal allows us to go ahead and not wait until somebody has taken it to that level in order for us to intervene. I can drop the trap and impact that inmate with a pepper ball or maybe chemically saturate that cell and get them to comply at an earlier stage instead of taking it all the way to the point where we're having to use serious injury or maybe even lethal force against an inmate. I don't have to wait until they use that amount of force in order for me to use. But less lethal is one more tool in that toolbox when you do have to deal with these dangerous incidents, use of force situations, cell extractions. So that's de-escalation for today. I hope you guys learned something. I hope that made sense. Sometimes I feel like I'm kind of jumping subject to subject, but I'm just trying to get that information out there and help people understand why it's so important and to bring about some change. Because an improvement in communication can never be wrong. Anytime we can improve communication between us and the inmates or in law enforcement with the suspects, anytime we can improve communication in our life, it's going to be a plus. Communication defeats things like hard feelings and misunderstandings and assumptions. All that stuff goes away when you have good communication. And that can be in your personal life too. And a lot of these techniques here, not all of them, don't go try confrontation avoidance on your spouse, but paraphrasing is a great way to let someone know that you understand and listened to what they said. And that can work at home or in business or at work in a prison. So these techniques can go a long ways to help you with your communication. There's tons of stuff on the internet. If you want to learn more about de-escalation, if you want to learn more about the different ways that you can improve your communication, just type it in and you're going to have lots of choices. A couple of books that have been very valuable to me, I'm going to go ahead and post below the podcast here in the information portion. So if you want to take a look at those books, they've been helpful to me over the years, and I hope they're helpful to you. Until next time, have a great day. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.